What settings should you use to film in slow motion? So essentially, one of the main things is you're going to want a really high frame rate, right? So the higher the frame rate, the slower you could slow the footage down. Because how this usually works is you would shoot at a high frame rate and then slow it down to 24 frames per second in your video editing software. You could slow it down to 30 frames per second as well, but typically what people are going to recommend when they're talking about a cinematic frame rate is going to be like 24 frames per second if you're in like North America and 25 frames per second if you're in Europe. This has to do with, specifics on, I can't even remember what the general term is, but essentially whether you're on the NTSC system or the PAL system, this has to do with regions of the world, and I think something to do with the power grid. I could be wrong about that. Just look up what NTSC and PAL means, PAL and NTSC, for the different filming modes or frequency modes or whatever, for the different regions of the world, and it might give you a better description than I am. This video isn't about that, so I'm going to move on from that, but anyway, that's a factor whether you shoot in 24 FPS or 25 FPS. But the key thing is one of those two frame rates, depending on where you are in the world, is going to be recommended as the more cinematic frame rate. 30 FPS is not going to usually be recommended as a cinematic frame rate. It's just not going to be necessarily as visually appealing in terms of, I think it has to do with a natural amount of motion blur. Now, I'm just kind of telling you stuff that I've heard from other people, so credit to all of the other people that have taught me what I know and what I'm relaying to you now in certain ways. So anyway, you're going to shoot at a higher frame rate, whether it's 60 FPS, because then when you slow that down to 24 frames per second, that's roughly 2 times slow-mo. I think it's technically a little bit more than 2 times slow-mo, because technically 2 times slow motion would be 48 frames per second, right? Because double of 24 is 48, so that would be 2 times slow-mo, but 60 FPS is even slower than that. And if you want to go even slower than that, you could shoot at 120 frames per second, or you could shoot at 240 frames per second. As far as I understand, I think 240 frames per second is 10 times slow motion. So think of that as really slow, right? Now, how do you determine how slow you want your footage to be in terms of which of these high frame rate numbers you should shoot at? Part of it is, I've literally kind of already said it, is how slow do you want it to be? Because if it's a dude jumping, maybe you don't want it to take 10 seconds for him to jump up and down. Maybe you only want it to take, let's say it in real time, it took him 1.5 seconds to jump up and down. Maybe you only want it to take 3 seconds, because maybe you don't want people to be waiting there forever to see him jump up and jump down. Maybe you just want it to be kind of instead of you know what I mean? Does that make sense? So what is the level of slow motion that you're going for? You're going to pick the frame rate accordingly. Think of the more frames, the more slow. Okay? Does that answer that question? Yeah, and so don't think about shutter speed when you think about slow motion. Shutter speed has nothing to do with how slow the video playback is. Shutter speed has to do with how bright or dark the image is and how much motion blur you're going to get. Frame rate also has to do with how much motion blur you're going to get, but that also depends on what the actual frame rate you have it set at in your video editor settings. So for example, you could shoot at 240 frames per second and have your video editor settings on your computer at 240 frames per second, where it's literally playing in real time at 240 frames per second. This might look weird because there's probably no motion blur, and it just looks funny, and it's this looks kind of weird. I think that live sports is filmed at 60 frames per second, I could be wrong, but I assume the reason for this, if I haven't already heard this somewhere, is that you want to like catch more of the action. So in this case, having motion blur might kind of work against it, because if you're seeing blurriness, you might not be able to see as well of what's going on because everybody's moving so fast. So then you're shooting at a higher frame rate, so less motion blur if your actual playback speed is 60 frames a second. The key thing to remember here is it really matters at what the actual frame rate of your final edited video is playing at. If you have your final edited video in your video editing software playing the video at 24 frames per second, then whenever you put something in there that's higher than 24 frames per second, if you slow that down to only play at 24 frames per second, like you have it set at in your timeline, then it's going to play that 240 frames per second video slower, right? It's going to play that slower because it's in a 24 frames per second video timeline in your editor. This makes more sense if you know a little bit about video editing software. If you don't, fair enough that it might sound confusing. So essentially your playback rate is what matters here. You technically, at least in Adobe Premiere Pro, you technically can just drop your 240 frames per second video into your 24 frames per second timeline and not change anything, and it plays back in real time still. So it doesn't look super slow or anything because you haven't slowed it down in the software. But it might look like really choppy because I think you're getting dropped frames, or whatever the term is, where essentially there's so many frames in the video per second, but you're having it set at only 24 frames per second. So then you're dropping all of the other frames at however it does that. So it's probably going to look really choppy, I think. I don't know if I've tried that where I've done it at 240 frames per second and 24 frames per second timeline without slowing it down. It's probably going to look pretty choppy because you have, I think, what's called dropped frames. I might be saying that wrong. But anyway, these things are worth considering. Hopefully I answered that. So, yeah. So what settings should I use to film in slow motion? To sum it all up, make that frame rate higher and then slow it down in your video editing software. Basically. The main thing that you need to pay attention to make the footage slow is that you film at a higher frame rate. So more frames per second equals more slow. So you want that thing to be really slow. Make sure your video editing software timeline is like 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second or whatever, and then film at like 60 frames per second or 120 or 240 frames, and slow it down to whatever that playback frame rate is in your video editing software. If it's 24 frames per second, you slow down the 240 frames per second to the 24 frames per second equivalent, and then all of a sudden it's super slow, and you just do that, right? Hopefully I covered that okay, you know what I mean, in the description. It could be maybe a little bit difficult to just say it in words without actually showing people, but there's probably no editing tutorials if you just look up how do I slow down my slow motion footage in Adobe Premiere Pro, and you could probably see somebody doing it in like 5 minutes or whatever, and it might kind of click more in your brain and make more sense. But anyway, I will leave that there. If you have more questions about cameras, I have my Skool Community, link in description. Feel free to join and ask the questions that you have there. Thank you guys for watching. Have a good day.